Mary Tudor burned almost 300 people alive. Men, women, teenagers, tied to stakes in market squares across England, and set on fire while crowds watched them die. History remembers her for it with a single, permanent word. It calls her Bloody Mary, the cruellest queen England ever had. But her father burned, hanged, and beheaded, on a scale tens of times larger than hers. Across his reign the bodies ran, by the most generous old estimate, into the tens of thousands. And her sister, the queen who came after her, hanged something like 600 people in a single winter, in the villages of the north, on her own direct order, and went on to execute close to 200 more across her reign. We do not call them bloody. We call her father a giant of English history. We call her sister Gloriana, Good Queen Bess, the Golden Age. One of these three monarchs got a nickname that has followed her for 500 years, and it was not the one with the highest body count. So here is the question this video is going to answer. If Mary Tudor was not even the bloodiest Tudor, if the man before her and the woman after her both killed more, then why is she the only one we call bloody? This is not the story of the Smithfield fires you were taught in school. You know that story already. The fanatic queen, the burning Protestants, the smoke over London. That story is real, and we are not going to argue it away. This is something narrower and stranger. This is a case file on a name, on 4 syllables that have outlived the woman who earned them by almost half a millennium. Because the burnings are a fact of history, but Bloody Mary is not a fact. It is a verdict, and somebody handed that verdict down. So the question stops being did she do it, and becomes who decided that this queen, out of all of them, would carry the word forever. There is a book at the center of this, and there is a year, a specific year, after she was already dead, when the English church took that book and chained it to the wall of every cathedral in the country, beside the Bible, where everyone had to read it. Hold on to that. We are going to get there. If that is the kind of history you are here for, the kind where the label everybody repeats turns out to have an author and a motive, then subscribe, because this whole channel is built on it. But before any of that, we have to stand in the fire. Because the case against Mary is strong, and you cannot understand how the name was built until you have felt why it stuck. Oxford, the 21st of March, 1556. It is raining, and a man is about to do something that no one in the crowd expects. His name is Thomas Cranmer, and until very recently he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest churchman in England, the man who had helped Mary's own father tear the country away from Rome, the man who had written the prayers the whole nation now prayed. He is 66 years old. For months he has been held, examined, worn down, and finally he broke. He signed his name to paper saying he had been wrong. He recanted. He renounced everything he had believed and built. By the law as it now stands, a recantation should have saved him. It did not. The decision had already been taken that he would burn anyway, so they bring him out to die, and they expect a broken man. They have even arranged for him to read his recantation aloud one last time, in public, so the whole crowd can hear the great Protestant archbishop confess that he was wrong. It is meant to be the regime's finest moment. Not just his body, but his soul, surrendered in front of witnesses. He stands up, he begins to speak, and then, in front of everyone, he turns. He says the recantation was forced out of him against his conscience. He says he renounces it, all of it, and that the hand which signed those papers, the hand that betrayed him, offended worse than any other part of him, and so that hand shall be the first to be punished. They drag him to the stake, they light the wood, and as the flames climb, Thomas Cranmer leans forward and pushes his right hand, the writing hand, the hand that signed the lie, down into the fire. He holds it there. He lets it burn first, while the rest of him is still alive to feel it, and the crowd hears him say it over and over. This hand hath offended. This hand hath offended. Remember that hand. We are going to come back to it. This is the memory of Mary's reign, not a statistic, a man putting his own hand into a fire to unsay a lie, in the rain, at Oxford. And he was not the first. A year earlier, in February of 1555, the very first of these fires had been lit at Smithfield, just outside London. The man tied to that first stake was John Rogers, a scholar and a Bible translator, and as they led him out, he was made to walk past his own wife and children on his way to the flames, and die in front of them. He was the proto-martyr, the first of the more than 280 who would follow him into the fire over the next 3.5 years. This is what England remembers when it says Bloody Mary. And it is true. Every word of it is true. The fires were real, they were public, they were ordered in her name, and they were savage. Which is exactly why this is so difficult, because to ask the question this video asks, you have to hold two things at once that feel like they should not fit together. The burnings happened, the horror was real, and the name is still a lie. Not about what she did, but about why she, and only she, became the one we remember for it. To see that, we have to do something uncomfortable first. We have to make the case against her as strongly as it can be made, because the prosecution is genuinely strong, and the stronger we make it now, the more it is going to matter, later, who actually wrote it down. Let us state the case for the prosecution honestly, the way the inherited verdict states it, and let us not flinch from it. When Mary came to the throne in July of 1553, England had spent 20 years being dragged, by her father, and then her young half-brother, away from the old religion. Her father had broken with the Pope, so he could divorce her mother. Her brother's advisors had gone much further, stripping the altars, banning the old Mass, remaking the English Church into something hard and Protestant. Mary believed, with the whole force of her being, that this was heresy, that the souls of her people were being led into damnation, and that God had put her on the throne to bring them back. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the devout Spanish princess her father had cast aside, and she had watched her own mother humiliated and her own self declared a bastard for the sake of the new religion. When she became queen, she meant to undo all of it. At first, the restoration was almost bloodless. She brought back the Mass. In November of 1554, the papal legate Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived and formally reconciled England to Rome. The prodigal nation welcomed back. And then, in that same period, the regime reached back into the medieval past and pulled out a weapon. In 1554, her parliament revived the old heresy laws. The medieval statute, known by its Latin name, De Heretico Comburendo, the law concerning the burning of heretics, first passed back in 1401, together with a further act of 1414. Under these revived laws, refusing to accept the central Catholic teaching of the Mass became a capital crime, and the prescribed punishment for that crime was to be burned alive. The statute took effect at the start of 1555, and the fires began that February. What followed is the part nobody disputes. Between February of 1555 and November of 1558, 3¾ years, more than 280 people were burned at the stake in England for heresy. The most commonly cited figures are 283 or 284. That number is firm. It traces back through the records to the martyrologists themselves, and modern historians, including Eamon Duffy, writing for Yale University Press, land on the same range. This is not a contested number. More than 280 human beings, burned alive for what they believed about bread and wine, and they were not anonymous. The regime burned the leadership of the English Reformation, by name, in public. John Rogers, the Bible translator, first at Smithfield. Then, in October of 1555, the bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, tied to a single stake together at Oxford, 2 old men burned side by side. And finally, in March of 1556, Thomas Cranmer himself, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the architect of the whole English break with Rome, the man we just watched push his own hand into the flames. These were not obscure deaths in distant villages. These were the most prominent religious figures in the country, executed in the most public way imaginable, in the cathedral cities and the capital, where the maximum number of people would see and remember. The London burnings were run largely by Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London, a name that would itself become a byword for cruelty. Bloody Bonner, they would later call him. The fires were deliberate. They were a policy. They were meant to be seen. So the case against Mary is not a smear in the sense of being false. She did revive the laws. She did sign off on the policy. The fires did burn in her name for nearly 4 years, and the people in them died horribly and publicly and for their faith. If the question were simply, did Mary Tudor preside over the burning of nearly 300 people for heresy, the answer is yes, plainly, and no honest account erases it. This video does not erase it. But notice, just notice, and hold it lightly for now, a couple of things that the settled verdict never seems to ask. Notice that we know these scenes in extraordinary detail. We know what Cranmer said at the stake. We know about Roger's wife and her 11 children at Smithfield. We have the dying words, the gestures, the faces in the crowd. Almost no other event of the 16th century comes down to us in this kind of vivid, novelistic close-up. Where did that come from? Somebody wrote it all down, in detail, with intent, and we will get to who. And notice the stranger thing. Notice that this is the only Tudor reign we instinctively measure by its body count at all. We do not, by reflex, tally up the dead of her father's reign or her sister's. We remember those reigns by their triumphs. Only this one reign gets reduced, in the popular memory, to the number it killed. Why only her? Hold those 2 questions, and hold one date, because I am telling you now, plainly, that it is going to matter before we are finished. Mary Tudor died on the 17th of November, 1558. Remember that date? The 17th of November. Now, to the evidence. Here is how we are going to do this. We are going to build a scoreboard. We are going to take the charge that Mary was uniquely, exceptionally bloody, the worst of them, and we are going to test it against the people standing on either side of her in the family portrait. We are going to count, and we are going to keep the running tally out loud so you can watch the case for her uniqueness fall apart one number at a time. Number 1, her father. Henry VIII is remembered as a colossus. The king who remade England, who built the navy, who broke from Rome, who fills more pages of the national story than almost anyone. He is the larger-than-life king of the 6 wives, played by great actors, painted by Holbein, planted in the center of the English imagination. He is many things in our memory. Bloody is not one of them. Now, there is a famous number attached to Henry, and I am going to handle it carefully, because the whole credibility of this video depends on me not lying to you with it. You will sometimes hear that Henry VIII executed 72,000 people. That number is everywhere, and it is almost certainly wrong, and I am not going to state it as a fact. Here is where it actually comes from. A Tudor writer named William Harrison, in a work called The Description of England, written in the 1570s and printed inside the famous Holinshed's Chronicles, claimed that under Henry VIII, thieves and vagabonds were hanged to the number of, in his phrase, 12,000. 72,000. That figure got repeated for centuries. The philosopher David Hume passed it along. It even surfaced in 19th century parliamentary debate, which lent it a false air of authority. But it is an Elizabethan-era estimate, not a count, and modern historians regard it as heavily inflated. So let me give you the honest version. The realistic modern estimate for the total number of executions across Henry's 38-year reign is somewhere around 20,000 to 25,000 people, roughly 700 a year. And crucially, almost none of those were religious burnings. Henry burned only around 80 people at the stake for heresy in his entire reign. The vast bulk were hangings, for theft, for vagrancy, for ordinary crime, plus the traitors and the rebels and the wives. And here is the thing I want you to sit with. Even when we throw out the inflated 72,000 and use the cautious, conservative, modern number, even at 20,000, Henry's reign killed something on the order of 70 or 80 times as many people as Mary's. His own daughter, the one we call Bloody, presided over fewer deaths in 5 years than her father did in an average 18 months. Now I have to be fair, and being fair is the whole point of this channel. So let me say the obvious objection out loud before you do. These are not the same kind of killing. Mary's 280 were burned specifically for their religion, as a deliberate campaign of faith. Henry's tens of thousands were mostly the ordinary grinding machinery of Tudor justice, thieves on the gallows across 4 decades. That is a real difference. It is apples and oranges. I am not going to pretend a pickpocket hanged in 1530 is the same as John Rogers burned for his faith in 1555. But hold that thought, that they were different categories of death, because it is going to come back, and when it does, it is going to cut the other way. For now, just register the raw asymmetry. The father killed on a scale tens of times larger than the daughter. He is Henry VIII, the Magnificent. She is Bloody Mary. That is 1. Keep counting. Number 2, her sister. When Mary died, the throne passed to her younger half-sister, Elizabeth, Mary's mirror image in almost every way. Where Mary was Catholic, Elizabeth was Protestant. Where Mary married a foreign king and was resented for it, Elizabeth never married and was adored for it. And where Mary became the byword for blood, Elizabeth became Gloriana, good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen of England's golden age, of Shakespeare and the Armada and the Sea Dogs, the reign we are taught to think of as the country's glorious dawn. So let us look at the blood under Gloriana. In the winter of 1569 and 1570, the Catholic north of England rose in revolt. The rising of the north, the rebellion of the northern earls, a rising partly in the name of the old religion and of Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth crushed it, and in the aftermath, she did something that the popular memory of good Queen Bess simply does not include. She declared martial law across the northern counties and ordered mass executions through the villages that had risen. The exact number is disputed. Estimates run from around 450 up toward 800. But the Queen's own stated demand was that at least 700 should hang. 700 people strung up across the north of England in a single winter on Elizabeth's direct and explicit order. Stop and put that beside the scoreboard. Mary burned roughly 280 people over the entire span of her reign, 3¾ years of fires. Elizabeth hanged something close to double that number in a matter of weeks, in one season, as reprisal. And we do not call her bloody. We call that winter a footnote, if we mention it at all. And that is before we even count the rest of Elizabeth's reign. Over her 44 years on the throne, the Elizabethan state executed somewhere between roughly 183 and 189 Catholics. The most commonly cited breakdown is about 126 priests and around 63 lay people who had sheltered them. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a death every bit as deliberate and gruesome as the fire, and they died, in practice, for being Catholic priests in England, or for hiding one. That is roughly the same order of magnitude as Mary's entire body count of religious victims, about 200 from Elizabeth's anti-Catholic campaign, against about 280 from Mary's anti-Protestant one, plus the several hundred more from that single northern winter. The sister killed comparably, arguably more, for religion, and she is Gloriana. I will deal with the obvious objection in a moment, because there is one, and it is the cleverest part of the whole machine. But first, sit with the simple arithmetic. Father, tens of thousands. Sister, hundreds for faith, plus hundreds more in one winter. Mary, 280. And only Mary is bloody. That is 2. Keep counting. Number 3. The law. Now to that clever objection I promised you. Someone is, quite rightly, going to say, this is a cheat. You cannot just add the numbers up like that, because they are not the same crime. Mary burned people for heresy, for what they believed. Elizabeth executed people for treason, for breaking the law of the land, for being agents of a hostile foreign power in a time of war and plots against her life. Henry mostly hanged ordinary criminals. 3 different legal categories. You are comparing things that cannot be compared, and on the surface, that is completely correct. The charges genuinely were different. Heresy, treason, felony. 3 separate doors to the scaffold. I am not going to wave that away, but look harder at it, because here is where it turns. Under Elizabeth, the law that sent those Catholic priests to be hanged, drawn and quartered, was the 1585 Act against Jesuits and seminary priests. And what that law did was breathtakingly simple. It made it high treason for a Catholic priest, ordained abroad, merely to be present on English soil. Not to plot, not to raise a rebellion, just to be a priest and to be in England. The act manufactured treason out of religion. It took men whose actual offence was their faith, and it relabeled that faith as a crime against the state, so that they could be executed as traitors rather than burned as martyrs. Do you see what that does? It means the difference between Mary's victims and Elizabeth's victims is not really a difference in what they died for. They both, in substance, died for being on the wrong side of the official religion. The difference is the paperwork. Mary's regime called it heresy and used fire. Elizabeth's regime called it treason and used the rope and the knife. And because treason sounds like a political crime and heresy sounds like a religious atrocity, history gave one queen a pass and hung the other with a nickname. The relabeling is the trick. The very thing that makes us instinctively excuse Elizabeth, "Oh, those were traitors, that was different," is itself a piece of stagecraft. The same act of killing for faith was simply dressed in cleaner legal clothes, and the dressing worked. It is still working on you and me right now. That is 3. Keep counting. I want to be honest about the limits of my own argument here, because that honesty is the whole reason you should trust the rest. The categories are not identical, and a careful historian would never collapse them completely. Heresy, treason, common felony. They meant different things in law and in the minds of the people who imposed them. I am not claiming the 3 reigns are morally interchangeable down to the last soul. What I am claiming is narrower, and it survives every correction you can throw at it, even after you separate the categories, even after you adjust for the different lengths of the reigns, even after you grant every benefit of the doubt. The woman with the smallest religious body count of the 3 became the only one with blood in her name. The asymmetry is not in the killing, it is in the remembering. And while you sit with that, let me ask you something, and I genuinely want the answer below. Have you ever been taught a one-word version of a person, a single label, the villain, the failure, the bad one, that you accepted for years before you ever heard the rest of the story and realized how much had been left out? If that has ever happened to you, tell me in the comments who it was. Because that is exactly what we are looking at here, at the scale of a nation and across 500 years. So if the killing does not explain it, what does? Why her? Number 4. The book. In the year 1563, 5 years after Mary was already dead and in the ground, a book was printed in London. Its author was a man named John Fox, a Protestant clergyman who had fled into exile on the continent while Mary was burning his co-religionists, and who came home after she died to a country now ruled by her Protestant sister. The book was called Acts and Monuments, though almost everyone has always known it by its nickname, Fox's Book of Martyrs. It was enormous. The first edition ran to something like 1,800 pages. It was a vast catalogue of Christian martyrs running back centuries, but its beating heart, the part everyone read and remembered, was its blow-by-blow account of the Protestants who had died in the fires of the reign that had just ended. Every burning we have talked about tonight, Rogers and his children at Smithfield, Latimer and Ridley at the single stake, Cranmer and his hand in the flames, comes down to us in the vivid form we know it, largely through Fox. The detail you found so unforgettable an hour ago, the dying words, the gestures, the faces, that is Fox's pen. He gathered the accounts, he shaped them, and he gave the English Reformation its martyrs. And it was not only words. The book was filled with woodcut illustrations, graphic, unforgettable pictures of Protestant men and women in the flames. Flames licking up around their bodies, their faces turned to heaven. The first edition had around 60 of these images. Later ones had far more. In a country where most ordinary people still could not read, those pictures did the persuading. They were, in a real sense, early mass media propaganda, atrocity images, printed and reprinted, burning themselves into the national eye. Now, I am introducing this book to you as a fact, and for the moment, I want you to hold it as nothing more than that. A man wrote a big, vivid, illustrated book about the people who died under Mary. That is all you need so far, because the truly significant thing about this book is not that it was written, it is what was done with it afterward, by people who were not John Fox, by the state itself. And that is the part I have been promising you since the very beginning. That is where this whole case turns over. If you have ever been remembered for your worst day, for the single worst thing you ever did, while everything else about you quietly disappeared, then you already understand, in your own small way, what was about to be done to a dead queen on a national scale. Tell me below if you know that feeling. And then stay with me, because we are about to open the book. Let me run the scoreboard one more time before we do, because you are going to need it clear in your head. 1. Her father, who killed on a scale tens of times larger, is Henry VIII, the Magnificent. 2. Her sister, who hanged hundreds in a single winter and executed nearly 200 Catholics across her reign, is Gloriana, the Golden Queen. 3. The law itself, which relabeled the very same crime, dying for your faith, as treason when it suited the winners, and as heresy when it suited them to burn you. And 4. The book. Hold the book. Now watch what the church did with it. Here is the fact I have been keeping from you. The fact that turns a big vivid book into a 500-year sentence. In 1571, 8 years after Fox's book first appeared, and 13 years after Mary was dead, the Convocation of Canterbury, the governing assembly of the Church of England itself, issued an order. It ordered that copies of Fox's Book of Martyrs be installed in every cathedral church in England. And not just installed, chained, physically chained to a desk or a lectern, the way only the most precious and authoritative volumes were secured, chained right next to the official Bible, so that the two books stood side by side. Senior clergy were ordered to keep copies in their own homes as well, where their servants and visitors could read them. Sit with the full weight of that. The accusation against Mary Tudor, Fox's catalogue of her fires with the woodcuts of burning Protestants, was taken by the church state and placed at the altar, literally, beside Holy Scripture, in every cathedral in the land, chained there so it could not be removed, for generations of English worshippers to read. For an ordinary churchgoer walking in to pray, the story of the martyrs and the Word of God sat at the same desk, bound by the same kind of chain, carrying the same kind of authority. Fox's version of Mary did not have to compete with other versions. It was the only version most people would ever meet, left there for 300 years. That is how you build a name that lasts 5 centuries, not by writing it once, by chaining it next to Scripture and walking away. And remember those vivid martyr scenes, the ones that made the case against Mary feel so overwhelming and so real. Here is the proof that this was a living, growing legend and not a fixed contemporary record. Take the most famous single sentence of the entire persecution. When the bishops Latimer and Ridley were burned together at Oxford, Latimer is supposed to have turned to his friend in the flames and said, "Be of good comfort, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." It is one of the most quoted lines in English history. It is carved into the memory of the Reformation, and it does not appear in the first edition of Fox's book. It is not in the 1563 text. It surfaces only later, in the 1583 edition, 20 years on. The single most iconic sentence of the martyrdoms, "The candle that would never go out," is very possibly a dramatic embellishment, added a generation after the event, as the legend was edited and polished and made more quotable across one printing after another. The story did not simply record the fires, it improved them. Now go back and pick up the date I made you remember. The 17th of November, 1558. The day Mary died. Watch what the winning side did with that single day. They did not let it pass. They turned the very date of the Catholic Queen's death into a national holiday. Elizabeth's accession day, Queen's Day, and they celebrated it year after year for around 300 years. Bells rang in every parish, bonfires were lit in the streets, and on those bonfires the crowds burned effigies of the Pope. The exact day on which Mary Tudor stopped breathing was converted into an annual Protestant carnival of anti-Catholic joy, complete with fire. In 1576, the Archbishop of Canterbury even issued official printed prayers of thanksgiving for the day, writing the celebration of Elizabeth into the liturgy of the Church itself. The day the Catholic Queen died became, by the deliberate design of the state, the day the Protestant nation threw a party. And there is one more thing about that day, and it is almost unbearable in its neatness. Mary did not die alone on the 17th of November. Cardinal Reginald Pole, the papal legate, the last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, the other great architect of her restoration of the Old Faith, died the very same day, within about 12 hours of her, in the same epidemic of influenza that was sweeping the country. The Queen and the Cardinal, the two people who had brought England back to Rome, died on the same afternoon. The entire Catholic restoration was buried in a single day, and the winners took that day and made it their festival of bonfires. So now run the whole scoreboard again, all four of them, through one single fact. And that fact is this: the side that did the remembering was the side that won. The father, Henry, killed on a scale tens of times larger, but he founded the Protestant break from Rome. So the Protestant tradition that wrote the history claimed him as its towering founder, not its butcher. The sister, Elizabeth, hanged hundreds in a winter and executed nearly 200 Catholics, but she was the Protestant champion under whom Fox's book was chained in the churches. So the same tradition crowned her Gloriana. The law relabeled identical deaths as treason or heresy, depending on which side was holding the match. And the book gathered up the one Catholic reign's victims, dramatized them, illustrated them, grew their legend across edition after edition, and the state chained it next to the Bible in every cathedral, and burned the Pope on the anniversary of the Queen's death for 300 years. The body count was never the variable. We proved that with the numbers. She killed the fewest for faith of the three. The religion of the people holding the pen was the variable. Henry and Elizabeth were Protestant, and Protestants wrote the history of England for the next 400 years. Mary was the one Catholic in the line, the one who ruled for the losing side, and she was the one who got the book, and the chain, and the name. Bloody Mary is not a description. It is a brand. It was engineered after her death by the side that defeated her religion, ratified by the state that profited from defeating it, and chained into the wall of every church so that no one could ever forget it or check it against the arithmetic. I want to be careful and exact here, because the truth is more interesting than an overstatement. Nobody sat in a room and coined the phrase Bloody Mary as a slogan. The exact nickname, in that settled form, comes later. It crystallizes in popular usage in the next century, in the 1600s. What happened is subtler and far more powerful than a coined slogan. Fox built the narrative. The state promoted it and chained it where everyone had to read it. The celebrations hammered it in once a year, and out of all that, over generations, the name simply condensed, the way steam condenses into water on a cold wall. Foxe did not coin Bloody Mary. Fox and the Elizabethan state built the machine that made Bloody Mary inevitable. The historians who have actually gone back to the sources say this plainly now. Eamon Duffy, writing for Yale University Press, argues the Catholic Restoration was effective and serious, not the work of a mere deranged fanatic. John Edwards, also for Yale University Press, set out to comprehensively replace the caricature with a fuller, more human account of the reign, and the Oxford historian Lucy Wooding, reviewing that work, said he had comprehensively defeated a persistent and painful historical myth. Thomas Freeman and Elizabeth Evenden, writing for Cambridge University Press, traced exactly how Fox's book was made and pushed out into the churches as the engine of English Protestant memory. And the biographer Linda Porter put it most sharply of all. Without Fox, she has written, Mary's burnings might have become a mere footnote to history. A footnote. The most notorious queen in English history might have been a footnote if the other side had not written the book and the state had not chained it to the wall. Let me be clear about what this is and is not. This is not an acquittal. 280 people burned to death in Mary Tudor's name, and nothing in this video brings a single one of them back or makes their deaths 1 degree less monstrous. John Rogers still walked past his children to the fire. Cranmer still held his hand in the flames. That is real, and it is hers, and she answered for it then, and answers for it now. But the punishment that history actually handed her was not for those 280 deaths. The punishment was to become, for 500 years, the single face of cruelty for an entire nation, the one name a child learns when they learn that queens can be monsters, while 2 monarchs with bloodier hands stood right beside her in the same gallery and were crowned great and golden and good. That is not justice. That is not even history quite. That is the verdict of the winners, frozen and chained to a wall, and recited by the rest of us ever since without checking the figures. So let me ask you to do one uncomfortable thing before you go. Imagine it were you. Imagine being remembered for only your worst 3 years, not your childhood, not your losses, not your reasons, just your worst 3 years. And imagine that the people who got to write that record were the very people who beat you, who took your throne and your religion and your country. And imagine they wrote it into a book and then chained that book to the wall of every church in the land beside the Holy Scripture, where everyone had to read it and no one was allowed to take it down, for 300 years. That is not a trial. There is no defense in a chained book. There is only the prosecution, repeated forever until the prosecution becomes the only thing anyone remembers your name meant. Which brings me to the question I actually want you to fight about in the comments, because I read every single one of them. Is Bloody Mary the most successful smear in English history? A 460-year-old piece of religious propaganda we still repeat, without thinking, every time we say her name. Or did she earn it, full stop? 280 bodies, no excuses. The nickname fits, and all the context in the world does not soften it. I have made my case. Now I want to hear yours. And I want to hear the strongest version of the side I argued against, because the people who disagree with this video are going to disagree well. And if, somewhere in the last hour, you found yourself thinking that the winners write the names, that the histories we inherit are written by whoever was holding the pen when the smoke cleared, then subscribe, because that is the only thing this channel is ever really about. Tell me one thing below before you go. Where did you first hear the words Bloody Mary? And did anyone ever tell you she was not even the bloodiest one in her own family?